Well, hey, good morning. Coming to you this morning on a Monday. Look forward to spending a little bit of time with you guys and talking a little bit about how industrialization is impacting the non-Western world. And so that's our goal this morning. And our topic today is we've been talking about how industrialization has impacted a lot of the world. Particularly, we've talked about how industrialization has changed Europe. We've talked about how industrialization has changed the United States. It's actually even helped the United States live up to its role of manifest destiny. Well, today we're going to be talking all about industrialization, but we're going to be talking about industrialization in regards to how the non-Western world is going to be impacted by that. And so that's what we're going to be doing now, is kind of just exploring a couple of the different ways that industrialization has impacted the non-Western world. In fact, our title of our lesson today is The Black Ships, Opium, Ottomans, and God's Chinese Son. So we're actually going to cover a lot of different things today as we kind of discuss how industrialization and westernization has impacted different parts of the world. And so it says that the non-Western world responded to industrialization in different ways. One of the things that we'll see is that industrialization had impacted the United States in a way that they embraced industrialization. They were all for industrialization. But we're also going to see today that industrialization was embraced very quickly by some European powers, but it was also rejected. It was kind of delayed by other non-Western European powers. And so the first country that we're going to go ahead and talk about today is a country we've mentioned before, a country called the Ottoman Empire. So if you look at the Ottoman Empire, it says that though the Ottoman Empire was close to Europe, it did not adopt Western technology. And so this is like the first thing that we're going to see about, is that even though the Ottoman Empire in proximity, it's really close to Europe, the Ottoman Empire, even though it is touching Europe, actually part of the Ottoman Empire is part of Europe, the Ottoman Empire does not embrace Western technology. They don't adopt Western technology. It's not something that happens right away from them. In fact, the second thing, it says they were close to Europe, they didn't adopt Western technology, but they also did not embrace the Enlightenment. So you might remember that this is kind of like the philosophy that's fueling everything. The Enlightenment is the philosophy that's fueling everything. And so we see that, all these different places all around the world, from the British to the French and the French Revolution to the 13 colonies, had embraced the Enlightenment, and that had kind of given the reasons behind revolution, the reasons for kind of this forward thinking. But we do not see that happening in the Ottoman Empire. And sadly, it says that for them, that this Ottoman Empire was in decline. And that's like a transition, because, there was a time that Muslims were conquering Europe from the West. You might remember that back in the 700s, that Muslims had invaded and they'd taken over Spain and they had taken over Portugal. You might remember that Muslims had invaded and had even taken over, as far going even into France. They had gone even as far as going into France. And that had now begun to change. The Muslims were being taken over. The Muslims were being kicked out of Spain and Portugal. There was something called the Reconquista, and Muslims had been expanding in the Balkan Peninsula. They had been enslaving Christian kids, making these slave soldiers. Well, all that was now changing as the Ottoman Empire was now in decline. So it says on the handout that the empire was also threatened to be torn apart by something called nationalism. Now, we've talked about this before. We said that nationalism is this intense pride in your country. Nationalism is this intense pride in your ethnic identity. And the Ottoman Empire had a lot of different ethnic identities. And as all these different ethnic identities, they came to, they had a renewed sense of pride. This was something that was going to rip the Ottoman Empire together. We see that same tendency with the Austrian Empire, which we'll talk about as we get into World War I. We see that same challenge in the Russian Empire, particularly as they blamed one particular group for their problems, the Jews. Tearing people apart was bringing people together. We saw that with the unification of Germany and the unification of Italy. So it says that they were torn apart by nationalism, and one part of the empire began to even become more and more independent. And the part that became more and more independent was Egypt. Now, Egypt, we've touched upon and we've talked about just a little bit in the past. It says that Egypt, you might remember that there was a practice we mentioned this just a little bit ago, there was a practice where Muslims would go into different areas and they would enslave Christians. They would enslave different individuals, and those slaves would become then soldiers. There was a name for these soldiers in Egypt that says slave soldiers. The Mamluks basically ruled Egypt. And that's kind of a different thing, because typically when we think about slaves, we're not thinking about people in power. When we think about slaves, we're typically not thinking about people in privilege or authority. But in the Muslim world, slavery was very different than the Atlantic world. For example, in the Muslim world, it was not uncommon that you would become a soldier, that you could even become a general, that you could become an administrator. So for the Muslim world, slavery was very different than the Atlantic world. The Atlantic world, you're a slave, you're going to become, you're going to be working in a field. In the Atlantic world, you're a slave, you're going to be perhaps taking care of children, working in a kitchen, harvesting sugarcane or cotton. But in the Muslim world, you could be a soldier, you could be a general, you could be an administrator. Now, there's also some really terrible things you could do also. Terrible thing that you could do also is you could become, you for sure could become a concubine. They do have that, but in general, it is a lot more advantages. There's a lot more opportunities to move up. In fact, there was so much moving up that the Ottoman Empire sees that basically these slaves are ruling a whole part of their empire, the Mamluks. And Muhammad Ali is a guy that you should know by name. Muhammad Ali is a man, and his job is to basically retake control of Egypt. That's his job, is to retake control of Egypt. And he goes to retake control from these slave soldiers that have exerted their independence. But when he gets to Egypt, he basically takes, it says that he ruled Egypt for himself, and there was nothing the Ottomans could do to stop him. So he was sent to retake control of Egypt, but he does, from these Mamluks, these slave soldiers who kind of had done their own thing. But when he gets there, he rules on his own, and there's nothing that the Ottoman Sultan can do about that. And under Muhammad Ali, he began a period in Egypt of modernization. That's what Muhammad Ali does. He begins a period of modernization. He brings Egypt into the modern world. He saw and understood the need to change Egypt so that Egypt didn't get taken advantage of in the same ways that other parts of the world were entering into decline. In fact, it says he wanted to make Egypt just like Europe. He knew that there's winners and there was losers in the world, and the losers in the world were those who refused to modernize. The losers in the world were those who refused to westernize. He wanted to make just like Europe. In fact, he did so many attempts to westernize. It says, he once said, quote, "My country is no longer in Africa. We are now part of Europe." And so obviously the geography of the empire doesn't change, but what he's saying is that when he looked at how his country, Egypt, looked after he started his rule, it was fundamentally different than how it looked from before he got there. So he says, my country's not even part of Africa anymore, how much it's changed, how much it's modernized. We are now part of Europe, he says. So in the 19th century, while Egypt is kind of going through a period of industrialization and modernization, and that's good for Egypt, more broadly, the entire Ottoman Empire isn't doing so hot. In fact, it says the Ottoman Empire had actually earned the nickname the sick man of Europe, that the Ottoman Empire was an empire in decline. The Ottoman Empire was an empire that wasn't doing so hot. And even though it is in the world of Europe, it is fading, and it's fading fast. They earned the nickname the sick man of Europe. One of their rivals to the north, who was super pleased that they were not doing well, were the Russians. Their rival to the north were the Russians. And the reason why the Russians were okay and the Russians wanted the Ottomans to do poorly was that the Russians, they had their greatest desire as the rival of the Ottoman Empire, that they wanted a warm water port. You might remember that this is like the greatest thing that Russia wants. Russia has hundreds of miles of coastline, but the problem with that hundreds of miles of coastline is it's frozen most of the year. And the thing that the Ottoman Empire had was access to the Black Sea, and after the Black Sea, the Mediterranean. And so they were okay fighting the Ottomans. They were okay getting into warfare with the Ottomans. They believed that the greatest thing that they could ever get from the Ottoman Empire was access to the Black Sea. And so that's definitely something that they worked on, and that's something that they were interested in. And it's going to cause problems. You know, they're going to be in conflict with Russia, Russia with the Ottomans. There's these rivals. And eventually, it says the Ottoman Empire would come to an end after World War I. And that's a long run for an empire. I mean, the Ottoman Empire is we talked earlier in the course about these three land-based Muslim empires: the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, and the Mughal Empire. The Ottoman Empire of those three is the longest lasting. You might remember the Safavid. They're like modern day Iran. They're a Shia majority. That's kind of what makes them different from all these other empires. They're a Shia majority. We also talked about the Mughal Empire in modern day India. What makes them different is that they are a Muslim minority ruling a Hindu majority. But the Ottoman Empire is the longest lasting of these three land-based empires, and they go all the way to World War I. They choose the wrong side. They become an ally of Germany. And after that, they actually get a name change, and they become the nation of Turkey. Because, again, think about this role of nationalism. The ethnic group that dominated the Ottoman Empire was Turkey, were the Turks. And so they become the Republic of Turkey, a country based around that national identity. So we still even see nationalism. Pretty much the rest of the empire broke off. They got independence based on nationalism. You know, the Arabs in what's modern day Saudi Arabia, they wanted their independence. Even though they were Muslims and the Turks were Muslims, nationalism was greater than their religious unity. And so the empire would break up. During the 19th century, the British and other Europeans were also interested tremendously in China. And you might remember there was a lot of stuff the Europeans were getting out of China. There was tea that the British had just been compulsively into and drinking and become part of British culture, right? And they were getting that from China. There was wallpaper. there was all these different porcelain products, and the Europeans were buying these Chinese goods. But there's a problem with that because there was not a lot of stuff that the Chinese were buying from the Europeans. It says that the British and other Europeans were upset over a negative balance of trade. There was a negative balance of trade. In other words, whenever you have a negative balance of trade, that means that you are buying a whole lot more than you are selling to someone. And that means your money is going out every single year. Your money is going out, it's going out, going out. And there's just not a lot of money going in. And so you might remember that they had tried to alleviate that problem. But the problem was that the Chinese did not want any European products. I mean, what was there that the Europeans really could sell the Chinese? There's not a whole lot. And you might remember that the British had also had sent a guy named Macartney to try to get the Chinese to open up their markets. The British and the Macartney mission had failed to open China to trade. They'd sent Macartney, his goal, you might remember that the Chinese only allowed the British to sell in one port. There was a city called Canton. And the argument was that you can't go anywhere other than Canton, this one treaty port, this one place, the Canton system, it was called. And the British didn't like that because there was so many more markets. I mean, China's the largest country in the world by population. And the British and all Europeans wanted to sell their goods throughout all of China. They sent this guy Macartney. His goal was to convince the Chinese to open up the markets. It was a dismal failure. It didn't work. And now the British go to plan B. So if we tried to peaceably, we tried to open up the Chinese to trade, well, what can we do? I mean, there's a transition, there's a change over time where the Europeans kind of like have this like almost like a man crush on the Chinese, where they like say, oh, the emperor's such a great guy, he's an intellectual, he's super smart. And then particularly after this Macartney mission fails, they begin to see China as a reluctant trade partner and actually as an enemy. And so they decide, well, what are we going to do? What are we going to do to kind of get China to force them to open up? And there is something they decide to do to force China to open up. They turn to a product that they've stumbled upon while ruling India that is going to have a huge demand in China. It says, the British resorted to selling to the Chinese the highly addictive drug called opium. And so opium is going to be this incredibly addictive drug. And it's going to be something that will be smoked. It's going to be something that is going to totally change elements of Chinese society. Opium is this highly addictive drug grown in India, shipped to China, and pushed on the Chinese people. And this smoked drug becomes so addictive, it starts to destroy elements of Chinese society. And the Chinese recognize this as a problem. And so what the Chinese do is they outlaw that. They say, well, this isn't going to be okay. The drug destroyed Chinese society, and they outlawed it. The Chinese outlawed it. The Chinese said, look, we don't want this product. We don't want you British bringing this in. This is something that is highly destructive. Now, the Europeans wanted to sell it because it was so addictive. The British knew that this is a product that's going to make them an incredible amount of money. So it says on the handout, as this continues, it says that the amount of opium smuggled into China in 1787 was 340 tons. 340 tons. So it was illegal, but the illegality of it did not stop the British from bringing this drug in. In fact, in that year, 1787, they snuck in 340 tons of opium. But those numbers continue to increase because there's so much money to be made by pushing drugs on the Chinese. It says on your handout that the amount of opium smuggled in 1833, look at this increase, was 2,500 tons. It was 2,500 tons. I mean, think about that huge increase. I mean, we were starting off with 340 tons, and now we're up to every year 2,500 tons of opium being pushed upon the Chinese people. So this is a huge increase, and the Chinese know that they need to do something about it. So the Chinese start increasing their anti-drug enforcement. They start destroying these drugs. And what are the British going to do? How are the British going to see the Chinese enforcing their anti-drug policy? It says the British saw the Chinese enforcement of their anti-drug laws as actually an act of war. For the British, they're making so much money by pushing drugs on the Chinese that when the Chinese say, look, we can't have this. This is destroying our society. This is no good. When the Chinese start enforcing these anti-drug laws, the British see this as an act of war. And the British, they, hypocritically, it doesn't really make sense. They say, listen, we are declaring war on you, China, in self-defense. We are declaring war on you, China, in self-defense. We are only going to invade you because we have to. You will threaten to destroy our economy by you not wanting to take the drugs that we're trying to sell you. So they saw that as an act of war. And in this so-called Opium War, in the so-called Opium War, the British quickly defeated the Chinese. They quickly defeated the Chinese. The problem is the Chinese do not have a modern army. The Chinese had never gone through modernization. The Chinese had never gone through Westernization. I mean, the Chinese, they have some soldiers that have bows and arrows. The Chinese, they have some soldiers that are still using swords and clubs. And the British have the benefits of Westernization. They have modern rifles, they have modern guns, they even have steamships that they can move their ships, their troops quickly up rivers, even these steam-powered boats that are small enough to go up rivers. And so the British, they quickly defeat the Chinese, and it is humiliating for them. Not only do the British beat the Chinese, but they continue to push drugs on the Chinese. It says that they also, not only did they defeat the Chinese, but they paid the cost of the war. Because the British beat so badly, the British say, look, China, you started this war by stopping the taking of our drugs. You have to pay for it. You're going to be the one that's going to have to actually compensate us for having to go over to China, beat you up, to force you to be able to allow us to sell our drugs. So the embarrassment upon embarrassment in these opium wars. The Chinese were also forced to give what's called treaty ports to the British. These were, you might remember, like the whole desire of the British were to get their goods into China. That was like their greatest desire. And so the British had been limited just going to the city of Canton. That was like the only place that they were allowed to go, this city called Canton. Well, after these treaty ports were agreed upon, there wasn't just one city, Canton, that the British could go to. There was a whole series of coastal communities that the British were given the okay to. It says that they were forced to give treaty ports, and the most famous city that the British get to hold on to is Hong Kong. And we've talked about Hong Kong a lot in the fall of 2019 as they saw these pro-democracy movement kind of going. And the reason why the citizens of Hong Kong have this vested interest in democracy is because they had experienced elements of democracy under British rule. Now, even though the British ruled Hong Kong, even though the British had taken Hong Kong from China, the British brought with them traditions of democracy. And those traditions of democracy were things that the people of Hong Kong were not willing to give up when they came back into under communist Chinese rule at the end of the 90s. But here, this is where we even see, why is it that Hong Kong is a British colony? Why is it that this major city has this British identity? It goes all the way back to the Opium Wars. So that's the most famous example. The British were also granted a word. There's something called extraterritoriality. And extraterritoriality means that British citizens could not be arrested by the Chinese, that you could not be arrested by the Chinese. What that means basically is that the British argue that if there's ever a crime that is committed, if there is ever an allegation that is committed against a British citizen in China, that the Chinese police, they cannot be the ones to arrest a British citizen. They cannot be the ones to question a British citizen. They said, look, if there's a crime, if there's an issue, if there's a concern, we will take care of it. We'll have British police in China. We'll have British police in these coastal communities, and we will make the arrests. We'll make the investigations. British citizens will not be allowed to be arrested in China. This is another example of something super embarrassing, extraterritoriality. We'll even see that there's going to be neighborhoods in China that Chinese are not allowed to go to. These are going to be British-only areas in China. And we'll see this also. The Ottoman Empire also kind of goes through this as well. The Ottoman Empire borrowed a lot of money trying to industrialize and like some last minute efforts. And they got into so much debt that they agreed to humiliating treaties, unequal treaties like extraterritoriality. So also in the Ottoman Empire, there was areas that the people of the Ottoman Empire could not go to. They were European-only areas. And so these are embarrassing. These are unequal treaties that the British experience. It's that the Chinese experience under the British. China, things got worse for China as well. Not only is there this humiliating experience of the Opium Wars, but China also from 1850 to 1864 entered a devastating civil war. There was a terrible civil war that came and wreaked havoc in China. And it was led by this man named Hong. And Hong was part of a Chinese Hakka, the Chinese Hakka community, and it was a minority group. The Hakkas were a minority group. There's a lot of different ethnic groups in China. And the group that this guy Hong was a part of was a group called the Hakkas, and they were an ethnic minority. And so you can imagine, as it is everywhere, as an ethnic minority, the Hakkas, his group, were kind of treated by many like trash. And this man Hong, he was an intellectual. He had trained preparing for the one thing that every intellectual wants to do in China, and that's to work for the Chinese government. And you might remember that if you want a job with the Chinese government, there's a test that you have to pass. It's called the civil service exam. And it says that in his preparations for that, he invested all of his time, all of his energy, but the bad news is that he failed the civil service exam, a test that was only passed by 1% of the population. I mean, think about the high stakes. Think about AP World. It's a tough test. AP World, I think somewhere about 50% of students who take the test pass the test. Well, the civil service exam, it really separated the the capable from the incapable. Only 1% of the people who spent their entire lifetime memorizing the Confucian classics ever passed the civil service exam, and he failed. And Hong has like a mental breakdown. Imagine you spent your entire life memorizing Confucius. Imagine that you spend your entire schooling in preparation for this test, and it brings shame upon you to fail. Hong fails the test. Well, when Hong fails the test, he's going to come into contact with a group of people who are new to China, to some Christian missionaries. In fact, he became very much interested in Christianity. He hears their preaching. He reads some of their literature. There were, the British, there was initially the Dutch and the Portuguese had brought Jesuits into China, but now the British are bringing Protestant elements into China. And these Protestants are publishing literature that the Chinese are reading, actually even in Chinese. And Hong became very interested in Christianity, especially as he's experiencing this like mental breakdown, having failed his test. It says that he ultimately came to reject Confucianism. In fact, there's stories that he would smash statues and different traditional representations in Confucianism and Buddhism and Taoism, that he was like, he got and understood certain elements of Christianity. He would destroy these different non-Christian statues and images. But he not only rejected Confucianism, but he saw the Chinese Manchu majority. And that was the name of the ethnic group that was the majority in China, the Manchu. He began to look at everything through the lens in his understanding of Christianity, where there is forces of good aligned with God, that is angels, that is Jesus, that's the Trinity, that's good. And there's forces of evil led by the devil and demons and anything that rejects Christian truth. And for Hong, he began to see that his own treatment poorly as an ethnic Hakka was responsible because of the majority in charge of China. And if that is true, then they must be on the side of evil. It says that he saw the Chinese Manchu majority as demonic. He actually believed that they were demon-possessed. The leadership of China was demonic, he believed, and he argued. And so if the leadership of China is demonically possessed, I don't have to listen, I don't have to honor, I don't have to believe in, I don't have to follow. And so he begins a civil war based on his fragmented and limited understanding of Christianity. In fact, it says that he led his followers of 30,000 in rebellion against China. Why not rebel against a kingdom that is led by demonically possessed leaders? Now, in his own movement, in this Taiping Rebellion, this is often called, is referred to as the Taiping Rebellion. During this movement, there's a couple things about his society. One of the things was that Hong believed that men and women should be segregated. He believed that men and women should be segregated. And he believed that not only that, but he went further, that sexual relationships should be prohibited. So he did not allow husbands and wives to live together. He did not allow those normal marital relationships to occur. He thought that was wrong. However, Hong and other leaders of his movement were known to have many concubines. And so even though for him, argument that it is bad for you to, for men and women to get along together in that way, even though he believed that it was something that would be better for men and women to be separate. that did not keep him and his followers in this Taiping movement, is what it's called, from actually having concubines. And so there's some hypocrisy there, right? He says, on the one hand, that you shouldn't have these men and women together. You shouldn't have sexual relationships. These sexual relationships were prohibited. They were not allowed. And this movement of him, called the Taiping movement, that's the name of his religious community, they banned these actions. But even though they banned those actions, they still are done among the leaders. And so the average person couldn't have it, but the leadership would. And the Taiping movement even goes a step further and says that who is Hong? What makes him so special? It says he taught he was the literal Son of God, that he was the literal Son of God, that just like you have, he believes in some form of Trinity. You have God the Father, you have God the Son, Jesus Christ, and you have God the Hong. He believes that he was literally the Son of God, and his movement, this Taiping movement, has authority because it is actually divinely backed. And if he is literally the Son of God, he also believed that he was then the brother of Jesus Christ, that he was the brother of Jesus Christ. And so this is why Hong has earned the nickname of God's Chinese son, that he believed, he's taking elements what he's hearing from Europeans. He's taking elements what he's hearing from Christianity, and he's repackaging it in his own understanding. And so there's a good word for this. This is a word that means that you're taking elements of religions, mixing them, fusing them, blending them together. You should remember the word is syncretism. Syncretism is this blending of faiths, and that's kind of what he does. He's put himself into the Trinity, God the Father, God the Son, God the Hong. He was also, in his religious beliefs, this Taiping movement, as it was called, was very much against the use of opium. They thought that drugs were bad. They thought drugs should be prohibited. You should not allow drugs. And he comes out very, very clearly that drugs are not something that their people are allowed to do. And this is where he really gets in trouble. Now, Europeans were kind of interested that there's this very popular movement kind of snowballing in popularity based on Christianity. But when the Europeans looked into it, they're like, whoa, that's like not okay, right? Like this isn't how it works. There's not, Jesus doesn't have a brother from China, right? And so the Europeans were concerned about this movement. But what really got the Europeans upset was when this guy started preaching that drugs are bad and you shouldn't be using them. It says on the handout that Europeans helped stop Hong because he challenged them economically and religiously. There was two ways that Hong messed up. He challenged the Europeans economically when he told his people, don't use drugs, drugs are bad. And he also challenged the Europeans religiously when he is repackaging Christianity in a very uniquely Chinese way. So those are the two things that get the Europeans to realize, hey, we need to get on board. We need to stop this. We need to make sure that the Chinese have our assistance. We're not going to help China stop this civil war because we love China. We're not going to help China stop the civil war because of our just greatest desire to help bring peace. They just want to help stop the civil war so they can sell more drugs to the Chinese. The death toll, this is an incredible death toll. The amount of people who die in the civil war are somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 30 million people. 20 to 30 million die in the Civil War. And that's a huge thing. This Taiping Rebellion, we call it, 20 to 30 million people die. And again, just for context, think about like World War II. In World War II, famous things that happened in World War II, you have 6 million Jews die in the Holocaust. Now, we also know other people died in the Holocaust as well. Gypsies, which are an ethnic minority, sometimes they're called the Roma people, they die in the Holocaust. Handicapped individuals, people with mental or physical challenges, they were killed in the Holocaust. Religious minorities, there's a religious minority from the United States, a religion from the United States that had moved to Europe and became popular called the Jehovah's Witnesses. These are all groups that were killed in total. We think in this concentration camp, the Holocaust, we think maybe about 12 million people died. Tragic. We study it. We're intrigued by it. We're horrified by it. 6 million Jews, 12 million total. That's big news. But this Taiping Rebellion, 20 to 30 million people died. And I would say it's probably something that we don't hear much about. We don't ever really study. We don't really know about it. There's probably not going to be a movie made on this topic like we see with the Holocaust. And we should make movies, and we should study, and we should be intrigued and horrified by the Holocaust. But think about this. There's a rebellion that kills 20 to 30 million. Nobody knows, nobody talks about, no one studies, but now we are. And this Taiping Rebellion, partly, it only would have happened, it only did happen because of Europeans bringing in their religious influences, those religious influences being reinterpreted in unique ways in China, and then the Europeans coming in also to choose one side as a winner, one side as a loser. European influence only increased as they divided up China into spheres of influence. Spheres of influence. Now, there's this really famous political cartoon that really illustrates what that meant for this time. And there's this illustration. It looks like China's almost looks like a pizza, and it looks like there's these 5 different people crouched around China to divide up, to tear it up, to separate it. And in fact, it says China on this, almost like this pizza pie. And to the far left, you have a woman with a knife in hand. This is none other than Queen Victoria, the British Empire. Next to her, you have this man, this upset-looking man with a helmet with a spike on top. This is none other than the newly unified German Empire. You have Russia next to them. You have France also represented as a woman. And then interestingly, and this was going to help us transition to our final topic, you have an Asian figure at the table. And this Asian figure, if you look at the table, there's actually what's a traditional Japanese sword, a katana is what it's called, on the table. And what they're doing is they're looking at the piece of the pie of China, looking to divide up China among themselves. And if you look at the very back, there is China protesting, but powerless to do anything about it. China is protesting, but powerless to do anything about it. And there at the table, not only are there white European countries at the table, but Japan is at the table now as well. And that brings us to the last topic is, what about Japan? You know, we talked about the opium of the British being sent in to take advantage of China. We talked about the Ottomans, kind of a mixed message with the Ottomans. One part of the Ottoman Empire, Egypt, does modernize to some degree. Other parts of the empire get into a lot of debt, and they get into these unfair treaties with the Europeans. We talked about God's Chinese son, but now we got to talk about the Japanese. Why is it that the Japanese are at the table? And so our last section we'll talk about is Japan and something called the Meiji Restoration. Unlike most Asian empires, Japan industrialized and modernized in less than 50 years. And that's an incredible transformation that unlike other Asian empires, Japan modernized and industrialized in less than 50 years. In fact, such rapid industrialization kept Japan from being conquered. The rest of Asia is being conquered. The empires that were in modern day India. India was being conquered by the British. Asia and Africa are being carved up. China, once the most powerful empire the world has ever seen, going back to forever, even before the era of Christ, China itself has fallen to European countries flexing their muscles and their imperial might, but Japan will not be conquered. It says that they had experienced a change of point of view. It says that isolationism had been the Japanese policy from 1600 to 1854. That's how the Japanese had kind of decided to deal with the problem of white Europeans showing up, is that they had said, this is a problem. You might remember that a bunch of Japanese had become open to Christianity. That freaked out the Japanese because the types of people that were open to Christianity were the poor, they were the lower class. And the Japanese thought, listen, that is like the worst thing could ever happen. Not only what happens if they not only reject our traditional Japanese religious beliefs, what happens if they not only accept European religious beliefs, what if they start rejecting Japanese political institutions? So they persecute and they try to get rid of the Christian influence in they even kick out, you might recall, the Jesuits. They kicked out the Jesuits. So isolationism had been how the Japanese dealt with Europeans, but then they start looking at their neighbor China. Now, China also had been kind of more and more inward looking. And so Japan is kind of looking at China and saying, how did that work out for China? How did it work out for China? How successful is it for you to kick out Europeans? How successful is it for you to fight and push back against Europeans? And then when you do get in a fight, because you've rejected Europeans, you rejected Westernization, you rejected industrialization, and you're fighting Europeans with like swords and bows and arrow and the club, how did that work out for China? Well, it didn't work out so hot. Maybe we need to think about a different strategy. It says the European nations from the West continue to try to open Japan up for trade. Even though Japan was not interested, even though Japan was rejecting Western Christian European influence, they kept knocking on the door of Japan, wanting trade. They kept wanting to do business with them. And Europeans also wanted to use Japan as a place to refuel. You might remember that coal is a new thing. You might remember that there's these transoceanic steamships, and these steamships, they need places to like refuel. You need coaling stations all around the world. This is one of the reasons why we, the United States, are interested in places like Hawaii, why we, the United States, are interested in picking up islands all throughout the Pacific Ocean. And that is one of the reasons why Europeans are kind of interested in looking at Japan. They wanted a place to refuel. And they got an unexpected visitor that really rocked the worldview of the Japanese, because they were used to Europeans coming. Europeans sailed from Europe around Africa, past around India, through the Straits of Malacca and through the South China Sea. Europeans, they were used to coming from the West. Europeans are used to coming from the Southwest. But for the first time, there was ships of white people who came from the East. And these ships of white people that came from the East were a group of people they had not yet came encounter with yet. This was a new group of white people, a new group of people that were increasingly modernizing and industrializing and rising to power. These ships from the East were from the United States. There was an unexpected visitor from the East, and this is the United States. The United States shows up with these famous black ships from the East. That's what the Japanese referred to our ships as. They were coming in to port. They referred to our ships as the black ships, and they were commanded by a guy named Commodore Matthew Perry, and he demanded that Japan trade with the United States. He demanded that Japan trade with the United States. Well, what do? You have a group of people, new people coming from an unexpected area. They have guns, they have modern steamships, and they're not asking. They're not requesting. They're not saying, hey, let's work. They're saying, we are demanding you opening yourself up to trade. Well, at the time, Japanese leadership didn't want a repeat of what happened to China. They looked to China and said, you know what happened to China when China said no? China got invaded. China got beat up. China got humiliated. They had to pay for the war. And then full-on parts of China, like Hong Kong, were actually given to Europeans. We don't want to happen to us what happened to China. And so leadership didn't want a repeat of what happened to China. And so the Japanese agreed to American demands. Now, this was super upsetting for a lot of elements in Japanese society. A lot of people in Japanese society says, that's not okay. Why would you surrender to the Americans? The Americans are not the same as the British. I mean, yeah, the British, they're super powerful. They got like the most powerful navy on the planet. The British control India. The British have successfully invaded and done military actions against China. Yeah, the British are powerful, but these Americans are, I mean, they've had some success on their Great Plains with Native Americans, but these Americans, this United States force, they're not the same thing as the British. So some people in Japan were upset that the Japanese government, the Japanese rulers were so quick to surrender to American demands. Some in Japan saw this as a mistake and instead encouraged resistance and modernization. There was some in Japan who saw this as a mistake, and they said, you know what we need to do instead of surrendering to the Americans? We need to have resistance against European demands. And the only way we can do that is through modernization. The only way that we can really resist the United States and other Europeans is through modernization. That's the difference between Japan and China. China had refused to modernize. China had closed themselves to the outside world so that when there's an actual fight, they're fighting the British with like clubs and swords and bows and arrows. The Japanese realized that is a strategy that's a losing strategy. We need to do something different. And so there's a name for this new period that Japan enters. This is a period of modernization. It's called the Meiji Restoration. This is where the shogun, who had been the traditional military leader, was overthrown, and there was a restoration of power of the emperor. It used to be the emperor was kind of just like a figurehead. He didn't really have a lot of power, authority, but they thought that the shogun messed up. They thought the shogun's strategy of surrendering to American demands was such a problem that there was a rebellion. They overthrow him and they restore the emperor to power. This phase of Japanese history is called the Meiji Restoration. And the thing about the Meiji, that the one word that should go in your mind with the Meiji is modernization. Meiji bring modernization to Japan. That's the most important thing about this period. It was a time period of westernization and modernization. It was a time of westernization and modernization. They realized that if you look around the world, the countries that are doing well are the Europeans, and the countries that are doing well are the Americans. If we want to do well, guess what we should do? We should copy what the Europeans are doing, and we should copy what the Americans are doing because they're winning, because they're expanding. If we don't change, we will be conquered. It was a time of westernization and modernization. To do that, this time of modernization was aided by visits that they made to Europe and the United States. They actually visited Europe to see how do their factories work. They visited Europe to see how have you set up your armies? How do you train your soldiers? They visited the United States to say, show us your train system, your train network. And in fact, they brought European engineers to Japan to build trains. They brought American engineers to Japan to build trains. But they did something really great, is that they started to train their own engineers in Japan. They brought over Americans and Europeans for a time, but they realized, you know what is going to be really important is if we train our own. They upped their schools so that they were able to train on their own without being dependent on Europeans or Americans for the long term. couple things that happened as they decide to modernize. They abolished feudalism in 1868. Feudalism is this kind of like what we see with like the serfs in Russia. Remember we ever talk about the Russians? We say, oh, the Russians are behind everyone else. The Russians are like backwards. Well, one of the things the Russians had was basically feudalism with like serfs tied to the land. It's an agrarian-based economy. The Japanese get rid of feudalism in 1868. They created a constitutional monarchy based on what they saw in the most powerful German-speaking nations in the world, based on what they saw in Prussia. You might remember we've talked about Prussia before. Prussia was the most powerful of the German-speaking states, and Prussia was the military powerhouse that unified Germany under its rule. So they copy Prussia. They also built a modern army and a modern navy as well. They also build roads and rail everywhere throughout Japan. They build a network of roads and rail. And to make all this transformation, factories for the first time, roads for the first time, rail for the first time, the government helps to subsidize or pay for modernization. They help pay for it. In fact, there's a painting, a famous painting on our handout, and it's a picture of Japan during the Meiji Restoration. And one of the things you'll notice is, how are the men dressed? They are dressed like Westerners. They're dressed not in traditional Japanese clothing, but they are dressed like how Europeans and Americans at the time dressed. They realize if we don't change, we'll die. Last thing to spend our last few minutes, there is a chart we're going to fill in on Japan's transformation. This kind of is looking at, on the far left, years, and then we have a couple of different things filled out for us already is coal production. There's nothing to write down for coal production. Let's just look at those numbers, and then we'll do the last two columns and we'll be done. So looking at coal is like this new fossil fuel, changes everything. It's countries that are winners are those who are using coal. Coal production, turns out Japan's got a lot of access to coal. 600,000 is the number of that we see from coal production. It doubles in 1885 to 1.2 million. 1895, it goes up again to 5 million. And look at 1913, the year before World War I, they're producing 23 million in that single year. Well, with the increase of coal production, and again, that's like one of the natural things that the British had going for them to help them become a world power. Look at steamships. You know, steam travel is going to be this thing that revolutionizes the world. In 1873, they have 26 steamships. So on the chart, I think we're going to fill this in. That in 1873, they have 26 steamships. And that number is going to go up little by little by little. The next number is 1894. Their steamships go up to 169 steamships in 1894. And then it's exponentially increasing. By 1904, the turn of the century, they've gone up to 797 steamships. In 1904, they go up to 797 steamships. I went from 169 to 797, and then the number doubles almost again. In 1913, the number goes to 1,514. If there's a country that understands the power of steam, of a navy, of modernization, it's Japan. The last column to look at is rail. We talked a little bit about rail in connecting the American West, telegraph and rail. We'll visit that again. But in 1872, the Japanese only have 18 miles of train track, 18 miles of rail. And look how that number increases exponentially. 1872, they only have 18 miles of it. By 1887, it goes up to 640 miles of rail. Look at 1894, it goes up again. It is now, again, think about this numbers. 1887, it was 640 miles. 1894, it goes up to 2,100 miles. That is an incredible increase in rail. Japan, under the Meiji Restoration, gets it. Look at 1904. The number doubles again, over than doubles to 4,700 miles of rail. 4,700 miles of rail. And the last number, 1914, 7,100 miles of rail. 7,100 miles of rail. There are different responses to industrialization and westernization. The Ottoman Empire has a mixed record. Part of the Ottoman Empire, Egypt under Muhammad Ali, understands it. He decides to try to modernize. He says, I can't even recognize my country. It's not even in Africa anymore. My country's now in Egypt. More broadly, the entire Ottoman Empire kind of fails to modernize. Nationalism gets the best of the Ottoman Empire. It fragments, breaks up. More broadly, the Ottoman Empire earns the nickname the sick man of Europe because of how poorly it's doing and how much it goes into decline. In China, we see that China had turned itself away from Europeans. Europeans then decided to embrace the policy of pushing drugs, opium on the Chinese. The Chinese rejected that, causing a series of humiliating defeats called the Opium War. All that was complicated by something called the Taiping Rebellion, a civil war in China that killed 30 million people, led by a man named Hong, who, being exposed to Christian preaching, came to believe that he was Jesus's younger brother, wiping out 30 million people in total warfare, whole cities being destroyed, and Europeans picking up the pieces, dividing up China among itself. The country in Asia that exemplifies the best example of learning from Europeans were the Japanese. Not expecting American ships from the East, led by Commodore Matthew Perry and his black ships, the Japanese freaked out, initially agreed to American demands, causing so many Japanese to be upset that the leadership made a mistake. They rebelled, and they put this new phase of Japanese history called the Meiji Restoration. The Meiji stand for one thing: modernization. And that modernization changes Japan so much, they really alone escape being conquered by Western powers. And Japan, because of the lessons of modernization they learn, are also going to copy something else that the Europeans are doing. Europeans are empire builders, and Japan, with a modern army, Japan with a modern navy, will also look to their horizons to see what kind of empire can they conquer. We'll see this ultimately come to fruition in World War II, as they even expand as far as a set of islands in the middle of the Pacific called Hawaii. I look forward to seeing you guys again next time as we continue to talk about how industrialization has changed the world.